Go ahead and be seated. Turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And as you're turning there, just give you forewarning. Today we are going to be looking at the issue of money because the teacher in Ecclesiastes brings this issue up. And the teacher is going to look at this from a very interesting angle. It's kind of interesting because Eastern thought is non-linear. Right? Western thought is very linear. We are products of Western culture and Western thinking, and so we are very linear in our thinking. We think in progressions, we think in steps, whereas Eastern thought is not linear at all. When we were in Romania, we went to a house that was owned by a Jewish man who was taken by the Nazis and put into a concentration camp and later wrote a book about it. And what was interesting there is we found his Hebrew Bible in his home, which has now been turned into a museum. And this friend of mine and I started looking through it. Now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I got enough to get by, but don't ask me to read it like reading English. I'm not good. He is really good. And so as we were looking through, what's interesting is even the way that the passages were numbered doesn't make a lot of sense to Western thinkers. And we kind of, as we were looking through this, it was a very poignant example of how Eastern thinking is just very different from Western thinking. We think 1, 2, 3, 4. They don't think that way. And so, for example, in a lot of Hebrew literature, in Genesis, for example, you have the creation of man, or of all 6 days, and then it jumps back and sort of zooms in on God's creation of Adam and Eve in chapter 2. And a lot of people struggle with that, but for a Jewish person, that's not a problem because they don't think linearly. They're not thinking on a timeline. So all of that to say that this passage and the structure of this passage in Ecclesiastes is not very friendly to linear Western thinkers. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to restructure this a little bit to help us see what the author is getting at. And I think it would be helpful for us on the front end to consider how the Bible talks about money in general. How we handle money tells us something deeper about our souls. The Bible speaks beyond the amoral object of money and addresses the heart behind our views and our use of money directly. So the Bible talks a lot about money, but never as an end, and always as a means to reveal something about our hearts and our longings. So let me give you a couple of examples. For example, in Luke 12, verses 16 through 21, Jesus told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man produced plentiful. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build large ones, and I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, what's the key verse in that parable is verse 19, where he says, the fool says, I will say to my soul, you have ample goods. So the issue is not money. The issue is the soul's attitude toward money as a means of providing comfort and relaxation and plenty and security and comfort. So in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus talks about money in verses 19 through 24, and this is probably a pretty familiar passage to a lot of people because it's the one where you get where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And in verse 19, he says, do not lay up for yourself treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. So he's saying here is that wealth and money are temporal and we cannot take them. Our hearts and our treasure are connected. Right? You see where he's getting at? He's not just dealing with the treasure. He's not just dealing with the items and the objects. He's dealing with them in connection to the heart that is treasuring them. So it's not bad to have stuff, it's bad to treasure things in your heart, right? That's what he's getting at. It's not just about the money, it's about where our treasure is, and our treasure is where our heart is. And so the point is made that you can set your heart on money, and money can become your treasure. And then in verse 24, he says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So all of this talk about money really comes down to a talk about heart treasuring things that actually causes you to serve one thing or the other. The point is treasure and love God, not money, right? Money serves to reveal our hearts. And it's treasuring is being loving toward or devoted to. And then in Mark 10, 17 to 22, there's the parable of the rich young man. And remember what happens? Jesus says, go sell all of your possessions and come follow me. And the comment that's given is he walked away very sad because he had many possessions. Jesus isn't railing on the evils of possessions. The comment is a comment on the heart orientation of the young man who would rather have all of his earthly possessions than have the God of the universe. He walked away sad rather than joyfully following Jesus, because he had a lot of possessions and he was unwilling to give them up. He loved them. He valued them. It's talking about his heart. And then in Hebrews 13:5, it says, keep yourselves free from the love of money. And that's directly tied to these other passages we've talked about. And the reason that we should keep ourselves free from the love of money in Hebrews is that God will never leave you or forsake you. And that frees us from depending upon money and hoping in money to depend on him and hope in him. So the point is that all of these passages that deal with money are really dealing with the heart. It's not really about the money as an end. The money is an avenue to going deeper into the heart. And so 1 out of every 7 verses in Luke talks about money. 11 of the 39 parables talk about money. Jesus said things like, it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, I've heard a lot that Jesus spoke about money more than he spoke about heaven and hell combined. And I'm inclined to disagree with that. Because in speaking about money, Jesus wasn't really speaking about money. Jesus didn't come to give us some moral principles to live by. He came to expose the depths of the sin in our hearts. Expose the idols of our lives, the replacements, the counterfeit gods that we erect on our pedestals of our hearts, so that they might be torn down and shown for what they really are and replaced by the only one who can truly satisfy our souls. And so Jesus spoke a lot about money. In fact, he spoke more about money than heaven and hell, but he did that to teach about the heart, not just give us good moral lessons to live by. He came to expose our corrupt hearts in order that they may be made new and freed from all of these idols that we're enslaved to. It just so happens that money and what money can buy is a particularly powerful idol that serves to reveal things that might otherwise be overlooked. Money is a prominent counterfeit god which subtly claims our hearts, our worship, our allegiance, and our longings. So money serves as a way of exposing our spiritual condition. It has a particular way of exposing where our hearts hope and what our hearts long for. With that said, turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And what we're going to see is the same idea, but presented in a slightly different way. And so the first point this morning that is shown in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 is that we have longing hearts that are unsatisfied. Look at chapter 5, verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This is also vanity. So money serves here as a vehicle to peer within the heart of man. And the problem is pretty clear. This doesn't take a lot of exposition, no matter how much you get. It's never enough. If your heart is set on money, you can never have enough. It never satisfies. It's like pedaling a bike, trying to get to a goal, but the harder you pedal, the further away the goal becomes. It's true of all of our loves and longings that are rooted in this world and divorced from any connection to God as our Creator. And the point here is that our hearts are made longing to be satisfied. And so apart from God, we try to satisfy these longings with all kinds of things. And these things will never meet the longings of our hearts because they were never intended to. They're incapable of it. Our hearts were made for something or someone else. And the sad irony is that the love of money and the pursuit of it, thinking that it will satisfy, actually creates more problems than it solves. Call it unintended consequences. So he sort of goes through this list. And look at verse 10. First of all, it never satisfies. We just showed that. There's always something more, something better. So we know this in a very unique way that the teacher probably would not have observed. So if you just take a look, take a step back, look around at our culture and our lives, you and I are bombarded constantly with advertisements. And what are these advertisements doing? They are preaching a gospel to us. They are preaching a sermon to us. And the point of the sermon is, if you have this, you will be satisfied. If you have this, your longing heart will be content. If you have this, you will be happy. An entire industry of marketing campaigns is built around this. You don't even need marketing campaigns, though, because we're born with desperately sick and wicked hearts. And so you take your child to the store and you make a wrong turn and you end up in the dreaded portal to hell known as the toy aisle. And all of a sudden, your child needs something. Something that they were blissfully unaware of 30 seconds ago. Now they need it to be happy. Why is that? What is that? Well, it's your little child's heart longing for something and seeking to have that longing satisfied. You never thought that walking into the toy aisle and dealing with your child needing something was a theological problem, did you? It is. And we all struggle with it. We see something else, we see something better, we see something that somebody else has, and we think, I need that. If only I could make enough to afford that, I would be happy. And this is basically the Old Testament way of saying what Paul said. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. Or what Jesus said in Mark 4:19 in the parable of the sower, where he talks about the parable, and he talks about the one that sprouted up and then it was choked out. And he said that the deceitfulness of wealth and desires for other things are what choked out the gospel. That's in Mark 4:19. So money doesn't satisfy the longings of our hearts. It's addictive but unsatisfactory. Then in verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? In other words, wealth attracts leeches who don't give a wealthy man peace. People want to be friends with wealthy people and suckle at their purse strings and try to get a piece of the pie. Wealthy people have many people who will cuddle up to them and get cozy as a means of advancing themselves or gaining something from a wealthy person. Always wanting to eat his food, drink his wine, get a handout, or just enjoy the fruits of the wealthy man's labor. And this leads to the wealthy man not knowing who's a genuine friend and who just wants something. Then in verse 12, we see that wealth multiplies worry. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats much or little, but full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. In other words, it doesn't satisfy, but we act as if it does. And therefore, the wealthy man has many sleepless nights worrying about how his stocks are performing or whether the latest deal is going to go through. It doesn't actually give the peace and rest that it promises, right? Because money promises us something. We look at it and we look around and we say, man, if I had more, I would just be so much more at ease. I would be so much more comfortable. And then with more money come more problems. And so this wealthy man doesn't actually get peace, but insomnia and worry about how the wealth is to be maintained and increased. And then in verse 13, we see that the love of money leads to hoarding. There's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt. A person consumed with gaining and accumulating wealth, it finds their identity in how much they have, will never actually use it and give it up and enjoy it because it's all about status. It's all about their perception of themselves, their worth and their value and their satisfaction being tied up in money. They suffer from a fear of loss. It becomes about accumulation, and there's a lot of intake, but never any output because that would deplete net worth, and that's really what it's all about. And then in verse 14, we see that wealth is an insecure basis for happiness and satisfaction because one foolish move, one turn of the economy, one bad deal, one bad business venture can take it all away. And those riches, verse 14, were lost in a bad venture. It's hard to gain. Wealth is hard to gain, but so incredibly easy to lose. Right? Let me give you an example of a bad venture that we've all probably succumbed to. Have you ever gotten to the end of the month and looked at your checkbook and been like, man, where did all the money go? And then you start analyzing line by line, and it's not that you spent $500 here or $300 here. It's that you spent $10 and $5 and $2 here and there. It's that you got nickeled and dimed out of hundreds of dollars over the course of the month, thinking each one was insignificant. Right? How easy was that to lose that money? And how hard was it to gain it? And then in verse 15, having shown that money is not a sure footing to build your life on, because it's Ecclesiastes, here we go. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again. Naked he came, naked he shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. You die. We spend our whole lives pursuing wealth, pursuing stuff, and then you die, and you can't take it with you. You come into the world naked, you're going out the same way. You don't bring anything with you, you don't take anything with you either. Right? I've heard people say there's no U-Hauls behind a hearse. My favorite is somebody's going to sell all of your favorite possessions for pennies on the dollar. That precious moments thing that you love so much that they're going to they're going to ask $1 for it and sell it for 25 cents because somebody's going to haggle them down. Right? That shows and throws into sharp contrast the futility of wealth and riches and possessions in our lives. All of the Pharaoh's treasures are still in there. And we took them out. And now they're in a museum somewhere. Right? That's the point. So the point is adequately made at this point that money cannot satisfy your longings. And all of these things, but what I want you to see is that in all of these things, there's a longing that's driving the heart to pursue money as a sense of satisfaction that'll satisfy that longings. And his point is just really simple. It doesn't do it. So the second point is this. The things of this earth were not meant to satisfy the longings of our hearts. So we see that money reveals the longings of our hearts, or that our hearts are made to long, and that money cannot satisfy those longings. But I want to look a little bit deeper into this because the teacher alludes to why these longings aren't satisfied by money. And I think while this is a very specific thing that he's talking about with regard to money, we can expand this out a little bit and make implications for all kinds of other things that are temporal and earthly. Because I think money sort of serves as an illustration for everything else in this life that we think will satisfy us, but leaves us wanting. So why do we find that we have these longings that nothing in this world can satisfy? This is a very Lewisian way of saying it. At this point, I think it's helpful to remind us that chapter 5 doesn't happen apart from the earlier chapters in the book. And in chapter 3, verse 11, the teacher tells us, almost in passing, that God has put eternity in our hearts. In other words, our hearts were not made to be satisfied in temporal things. Our hearts were not made to be satisfied in the temporal things of this life. And the temporal things in this life were not made to satisfy the longings of our hearts. It's a massive point. It's very easy to overlook. So I'm going to linger here for just a minute. It's crucial that we all get this. Not only was your heart and my heart made to not be satisfied with the transient things of this world, which includes all kinds of things, marriage, kids, success, fame, money, respect, position, all kinds of things. Not only were our hearts not made to be satisfied in those things, but all of those things, as wonderful and good as they can be, were not made to satisfy our hearts. You see what's going on there? It kind of hits you from both sides, doesn't it? We think if I had this, I would be happy. And our inclination is to say, no, your heart wasn't made to be happy in this thing. That is true. But that's only one half of it. If I have this thing, then I'll be happy. The other side of that is no, because none of these things were made to satisfy your heart. Not only will your heart not be satisfied in them, they were never meant to be means of satisfaction for your heart. They're not designed that way. They're not created for that purpose. It's like trying to do surgery with a chainsaw. It's not what it was designed for, and no matter how hard you try to make it work, it's incapable of making the surgical cuts necessary for an appendectomy. All you're going to do is leave a massive mess. And it doesn't matter how good you are with a chainsaw. The chainsaw wasn't made for surgery. It's the same thing with all the things in this world. They were never meant to satisfy our hearts. They were never made to satisfy our hearts. And no matter how hard we might try, we cannot change the inclination of our hearts that desire, and we cannot change the objects to satisfy those inclinations, right? Our hearts were made for something else. Those things were not made for our hearts. So think about all these things that he just said in that list. And it's easy to get it from the perspective of your hearts won't be satisfied in these things, but think of this from the other perspective too. They were never made to satisfy your heart. That's why riches are fleeting. That's why you can't take stuff with you when you die. That's why everything is so fragile. If they were really made to satisfy your longing heart, there would be an eternal aspect to them, because our hearts are made with eternal longings. These things can be lost in an instant. They lead to additional worries and problems. Ultimately, you die and can't take them with you. They don't satisfy because they can't, and they can't because they were never meant to. This applies, again, to all kinds of things. But the temporal nature of our idols, the things that we erect on the throne of our hearts, seeking to satisfy our longing hearts with these things, the temporal nature of these idols witness to the fact that they were never meant to be objects of our heart's affection and longing and worship. And even if they could satisfy, And even if we convince ourselves that they somehow do, through some sort of self-delusion, there's the stubborn issue of death that breaks that apart. So we see that we really have two problems. The first is that the longing of our heart will not be satisfied by these things. And the second is that these things were actually not intended to, created for, or able to satisfy the longing. And this is why no matter how much we get, we're always left wanting. They remain incapable of satisfying our longing hearts. They remain fragile and fleeting. And that's the point the teacher makes in chapter 6, verses 3 to 6. Look over there. In chapter 6, verses 3 to 6, he says, "If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul," right? Catch that? "is not satisfied with life's good things, and he also has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. Moreover, it is not seen the sun or known anything, yet it finds rest rather than he. Even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to one place? All the toil of a man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is never satisfied." And what he does here is he ties in three elements of what Orientals would have considered happiness: wealth, long life, and many children. And he says that a stillborn who dies is better off than a person who lives their life pursuing that which is meaningless and cannot satisfy the longings of his soul. So the point is clear: earthly gain cannot satisfy an eternal soul. And you and I have been made with eternal souls. We've been made with hearts that are wired for eternity. Our time here on earth is fleeting and temporary. And this broken world is not what our hearts were created for. And therefore, nothing in this world can satisfy the longings of an eternal heart and an eternal soul. And that's why we get so upside down and backwards and wrapped around the axle and frustrated when we try to make a round peg fit in a square hole. It just doesn't work. It's not meant to work. So our hearts were made for eternity, and nothing in this temporal world can satisfy them. So what do? It brings us to the third point. And that is that eternal hearts are satisfied only in an eternal God. The teacher contrasts a good and a bad approach to life in light of the fact that we have longing hearts and that these longing hearts cannot be satisfied by temporal things. So the first one is the bad. We see that in chapter 6, verses 1 to 2, where he says, "There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind, a man to whom God gives wealth, possession, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all he desires, yet God does not give him the power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity and a grievous evil." So that's the bad way of looking at this, right? Then there's the good way, which we find in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. He says this, "Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possession and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart." So the first one, the bad one, the person is given great wealth by God without the ability to enjoy it. He can have anything his heart longs for, yet he's never satisfied, because even though every desire of his heart can be met, his heart never desires God. Nothing is more pitiful than a rich person who is unable to enjoy his riches, and no amount of prosperity can make up for a life without joy. But then the good side of that is there's a person who enjoys the gifts of God's grace as gifts of God's grace. He's able to enjoy the things of this world as God intended, not as ultimate, but as gifts meant to be enjoyed. He is occupied with joy in his heart and not with the pain of mortal life. So there's a few things I think we need to observe here. The first one is starting in verse 18, God is actually brought into the picture. Prior to verse 18, God's not mentioned in this passage. And then in verse 18, God comes into the picture, and that's a significant clue to how we are to orient ourselves when thinking about this. So God is the solution to satisfy the longings of our hearts. This person in verses 18 to 20 enjoys life because he is content with the lot that God has given him in verse 18. He recognizes everything he has comes from God in verse 19. Not only that, but God has given him the power to enjoy them rightly, to be content with where God has him, and to enjoy the tasks that God has given him. And then in verse 20, we see that God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. That means that happiness and contentment and joy are dependent upon God giving them, not with the material possessions that we accumulate. You notice that there's no difference between these two as far as their wealth? God gives wealth to both of them. What's the difference? One of them has the capacity given by God to enjoy them rightly, and the other one is enjoying them as if they are God. Notice how the shift happened. It's God who gives joy and contentment in the things as the giver, rather than the things giving joy and contentment in themselves. The things serve as a means to point us to God rather than a pseudo-God themselves. They are seen not as ultimate, but point to the one who is ultimate. In other words, for the person in chapter 5, the things that God has given him are means of enjoyment and contentment in God. For the person in chapter 6, they are means of joy and contentment in themselves, and he does not find it. Now compare the good and the bad that the preacher lays out, and what's the difference? It's not the stuff. It's that God has given the capacity to enjoy them. He has given the power to enjoy them. That's the difference. It's God's grace at work that makes the difference. It's God giving the power to enjoy things rightly that leads to joy in God. That's the difference. If God does not grant his grace in this way, we will be left with longing hearts that nothing can satisfy, because our hearts were meant to be satisfied in him. And moreover, I think there's an implication that God, in his granting of enjoyment of his gifts, is granting that we enjoy them rightly. Not as things to satisfy our heart, but as enjoyment of good gifts from a heart that is satisfied in God. So what we need to see is that our hearts were made for Eden, but Eden was not made for our hearts. Here's what I mean by that. Our hearts were made for Eden, meaning we are made to enjoy intimate fellowship with God. What was the good of the garden? The good was that God was there. God was present. We were made for him. Let us create man in our image, in our likeness. Let him have dominion. There were tasks. That was not ultimate. What was ultimate was God. He was there. We were in fellowship with him in the garden. So our hearts were made for Eden. Our hearts were made to live with God and find enjoyment and satisfaction in God. We are made to enjoy his creation as an avenue to enjoyment and worship of him. But then I also said that Eden wasn't made for our hearts, meaning that the creation was made for God, not for our hearts. It wasn't made to satisfy the longing of our hearts. When longings of hearts go awry, you reach out and grab and take and eat. That's never what it was intended for. Eden was not meant to satisfy the longing of our hearts. Eden was meant as an avenue for the enjoyment of God who satisfies the longing of our hearts. So creation was never meant to meet that need. It was meant to point us to God. Now add to that the impact of sin and brokenness, living in the ashes of Eden, and we begin to see the absolute folly of trying to satisfy the longing of our hearts apart from God. There is no true satisfaction in creation apart from God. There is no true joy in the ashes of Eden apart from joy that comes from God. If we're honest, we seem to have a sense that in heaven we will be homesick. Right? Have you ever heard people talk about heaven as if it's like, I really don't want to go there? Or just be floating in clouds? What about all of the things I love here on this earth? Or for my parents, it's horses and dogs. For some people, it might be baseball. There will be baseball in heaven. And the Red Sox will beat the Yankees every single game. Those idols creeping up. But we live as if we're going to be homesick in heaven. Right? And why is that? It's because all we know is here. And the reality that the Bible teaches us is that we were not made for here. How can you be homesick for some place that you weren't made to live in for eternity? Reality is actually reversed. We're homesick here. We have eternity in our hearts. We have longings in our hearts that nothing in this earth can satisfy because we were not made for this mortal existence alone. So we are homesick here, and we seek to satisfy that homesickness with something other than home. It's like we're looking at a picture while away from our spouse and thinking more pictures are going to satisfy the longing to be with our spouse. The picture can be, and then we accumulate all of these pictures, and we're still left longing for our spouse, and that will only be truly satisfied when we have a face-to-face reunion. And here's the point. We're not meant to be at home here. And to live as if we are at home here leads to despair and ruin. I think that's what the teacher is getting at. We're away from home, and we must learn to see our absence as just that, and that nothing here will satisfy the homesickness of our hearts that were made for eternity. And lest we try to be more spiritual than the Bible is, satisfaction in God is not just contentment. Satisfaction in God involves the power to enjoy his good gifts here and now. Did you see that in chapter 5, verses 18 to 20? Look at verse 18. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. For this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is a gift from God. Satisfaction in God involves the power to enjoy God's good gifts here and now because it is a foretaste of home. It's not wrong to enjoy the picture of your spouse when you're apart. It is wrong to accumulate pictures and try to make that a replacement for face-to-face. And all of the things that God has given us here are meant to be enjoyed as an avenue to enjoying God and as a foretaste, as an appetizer of the feast of eternity, where we will be with him face to face, and all of those longings will be satisfied for eternity. And not only that, he's going to make a new heaven and a new earth, and we get to be in the new earth, and we get to do all of these things that he created us for, but we'll be doing it rightly. All of those things will serve their intended function, and our hearts will find its longing met, not in those things, but in God. So let me close by taking this back to the teaching on money and possessions that I started with from the New Testament. In chapter 5, verse 20 of Ecclesiastes, it says, "For he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart." God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. The joy doesn't come from the things. The joy comes from having God and being satisfied in God through enjoying the good gifts that God gives, because he's also given the capacity to do that. Joy comes from God, and the object of true joy is God himself, which is why Paul says in Philippians, "Rejoice in the Lord. Again, I say rejoice." Or why the psalmist says, "You have made known to me the paths of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." And if God occupies our hearts with joy, if our treasure is God, if we seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, we will live free. Free from the love of money, free to enjoy God's good gifts rightly, not as idols, but as avenues. Free to have undivided hearts that serve God and not money, and yet at the same time enjoy the good, gracious gifts that God gives us. As we delight in God, he gives us the desires of our hearts in Psalm 34, which is himself. And when we have him, we're truly satisfied, and we're able to live free of the love of money and riches and temporal things. And that enables us to enjoy our family, enjoy our work, enjoy our possessions, and enjoy our wealth and all the other temporal things rightly. Not as idols, but as gracious gifts that are an avenue to the giver. And then we get to invite others into that. We're free, in other words, to live differently so that those who have money and possessions but have not been given the power to really and rightly enjoy them can look at us and see something wonderfully and compellingly different. And then perhaps ask us, and we get the opportunity to tell them. We're free to be satisfied in this life in God. We don't have to go through life with discontentment everywhere we turn. We're free to be satisfied in what God has given us because we're satisfied in God. And we do that knowing one day we will die. And all of the enjoyments of this life will be seen for what they are, shadows. We will leave the shadowlands, and we will go to the place that all of this was meant to point us to. And all of those appetizers that leave you wanting more will be met in the feast for eternity, where there will be enjoyment of him and his gifts in the new heaven and the new earth. And so the challenge for us is to live in that reality now, to see things rightly, to see that we have longing hearts, that we're made for eternity. And because of that, nothing in this earth can satisfy those longings of our hearts. But they can be satisfied in God, which then enables us to enjoy life and creation and the good gifts that he has given us. Let's pray.